Okay, Rob, great. Thank you very much. To all of you who are just joining us for the regular Thursday International Trade and Macro Seminar, welcome. We just finished up a talk by Rob Johnson as part of the International Trade Dynamics workshop, the annual workshop that we've been running that this year has gone virtual. And so part of that is we are kind of overlapping Jim Tybout's keynote talk with the virtual Trade and Macro Seminar. So welcome everybody. We look like we're in good shape. Jim, I can see your slides. Perfect. We are, so we're ready to go. It's 1 o'clock. We'll give it just kind of one more minute because academics are always late. And then usual rules. Jim, you have an hour. People who want to ask questions, just unmute yourself and break in like you normally would, or you can raise your hand if you want, but it tends to work better if you just kind of break in. And then we'll have some time at 3 o'clock for more discussion and a break. Okay, so Jim, without any further chat from me, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
All right, well, thanks a lot, Kim. And thanks to all the organizers for inviting me to be in part of this, and also for podcasting further into cyberspace via the ITM workshop. I wanted to talk about an ongoing project that I've been working on with Nizzy Gunnar and Alessandro Ruggieri, who may or may not be online with us, but they'll make themselves known if they are, I guess, at some point. Let me start by giving you just a few stylized facts that initially motivated this project. These are familiar to most of you, so I don't want to spend much time on it. Put a reference or two in parentheses here if you want to pursue the details, but most of you already know about this. Skill premiums have grown for college-educated workers since 1980 in the United States. At the same time, the fraction of the population attending college has grown. The jobs in the middle of the skill distribution have become relatively scarce. Manufacturing workforce has shifted towards services. Job turnover rates have fallen. This is something John Hollwanger has stressed a lot. And finally, and this may not be as widely known, on-the-job training times have increased. So we want to develop a model that explains the driving forces behind these developments and focus on globalization and skill-based technological change. Now that's not a new game at all. It's been going on for 10 years. Our twist is we want to approach this from the perspective of career path implications. To put it differently, we're thinking of globalization and skill-based technological change as affecting the ease with which different types of workers can move along different career paths. So just diagrammatically, we're thinking of those two things as being exogenous shocks, and then the options available to workers are going to evolve, and that in turn is going to drive the labor market outcomes that I showed you on the previous slide. And of course, it'll also impact different workers very differently in terms of their life cycle experiences. So what do we mean by a career path? That's just a sequence of jobs and unemployment spells. One well-known example of a career path is promoted by Horatio Alger in his books. You start out as a delivery boy and you work for a while, and then people discover how good you are and you become a mailroom manager or a worker, and they even like you more there, and so you get promoted to production worker and then middle manager and then CEO by the time you're 40 or 50. That's probably apocryphal. There may be somebody who's done that, but it's not a standard career path. So just to get a little more realistic, I went on the web this weekend and pretended I was a guidance counselor looking around for career paths that actually get used. And here's what I found. This one is for a career in manufacturing. I apologize for the small fonts. I didn't see any way to get around that, especially if you're on a smartphone. That may be an issue. Let me talk you through it. So the first box here is before you enter the job market, you're just thinking, well, I'd like to have a career in manufacturing. And then you emerge out of high school, and your first job will be a production worker, and you get maybe $30,000 a year. And so you work. That's what these circular arrows are, I assume. And as you work, you acquire some experience, and eventually you become expert enough that you're certified as a good production worker, and you're eligible to become a production supervisor. So at that point, your salary jumps up to $52,000, and you work some more and acquire further expertise. But at this point, notice you're not just acquiring experience, you're also getting training in the form of internship and maybe some night classes. And so eventually you become good enough to become an industrial production manager. And that's another salary bump. Now you're up to about $85,000 a year. But if you want to go past that, then it says in tiny font up here, you need a bachelor's degree. And you should have planned for that before you even entered the job market. So a couple things to note here. First, in the lower rungs of the job ladder, there was no training going on, it was just experience. But once you got up in the middle, experience started to be augmented by explicit training. And that's what made it possible to move up another rung. Next thing to note is this is the manufacturing sector, and that's been hurt by globalization, of course. So if you look at the rates of job growth in these different ladder rungs, they're pretty small. And especially in this middle rung here, job growth rates have been actually negative. Now, this is just a local job market in Western Ohio, but I mean, it seems realistic to me to see similar things elsewhere. So what does that mean? That means if you enter this career path and you get this far, you may end up waiting a while before job offers start to arrive for you, and the opportunity presents itself to move to the next rung. So we can get people piling up here in the lowest rung of the job ladder. And as you might expect, that's going to be one feature of the model. When globalization makes certain types of jobs relatively scarce, that's going to create waits for workers. And in the presence of labor market frictions, that's going to matter. So that's a sector that was probably hurt by globalization shock. Here's one that was more likely to be affected by technology shock. This is business administrative services. So again, you start out in high school and you're thinking, well, I'd love to be in business. And then when you emerge into the market, the first job available to you is a billing clerk, and you work here, and you're getting paid a salary of $32,000. As your experience accumulates, you become qualified to move to the next level, and then you can be a purchasing agent, and you acquire experience here. But again, you're getting training from your employer in the form of internship and maybe taking some night classes. And so eventually you become eligible to be a purchasing manager and earn $92,000 a year. But here too, just as we saw in manufacturing, this middle rung has very low job growth. And so it could be technology knock that out. And again, you get people piling up down here, waiting for opportunities at the next rung, which are hard to come by. Notice also, if you want to go past this last point here, again, you need a college degree, and you should have planned for that at the beginning of your career. So what careers take a different form? Well, health sciences is one where there's no competition from imports, and technology shocks don't seem to have damaged it too much. So here you can see, if you want to start your career this way, you can jump into a medical assistant job, and those are growing at like 20% a year, or more than 20% in Western Ohio. So it's probably not too hard to find that job. I'm not sure what that means. It may just be a receptionist, but anyway, it's a start, and you acquire experience here, and then when you get enough, you're eligible to be a respiratory therapist, telling people how to breathe, and that's a $52,000 job. So that's pretty good. And the appeal here is these jobs are growing rapidly over the past 10 years. So we don't get any missing wrong in the job ladder in this career path. But notice, if you want to go any further, right away you need a bachelor's degree. So you never get into the $90,000 range without planning ahead and getting that done. Anyway, these are just examples, and I don't want you to take them too seriously, but they kind of motivate the model I want to lay out in a few minutes, and that's why I focused on them. The basic idea is going to be the following. We're going to have people emerging from high school, and they're going to be heterogeneous in terms of their abilities. And depending upon what abilities they have, they'll decide whether to attend college or not. If they enter the job market immediately out of high school, then they'll search in the labor market and eventually match with an employer who's looking to hire a particular type of worker, whether it's somebody with assembly skills or transportation skills or whatever. And you're off to the races. If you delay entering the market and go to college, well, then you do the same thing, but after getting your 4-year degree. And once you've matched with an employer, because it's a frictional market, there are rents to be had associated with that match, and you bargain over those rents, and that determines your wages. Over time, your wages are going to drift up because you're acquiring experience, and that experience is making you more valuable. And every time you get a bump your experience, then you renegotiate your wages. Your ability may also improve if your employer invests in on-the-job training for you. And she's only going to do that if that increases the rents associated with the match. So over the life cycle, your wage growth is going to be driven by improvements in your ability, which in turn trace back to experience and perhaps also on-the-job training. It will also be driven by shocks to employer profitability, which is to say each employer's got an idiosyncratic shock, and those are going to affect rents from the matches as well. Now, in addition to those things, it's possible that when you're on the job, offers will arrive from poaching employers, and you might be able to walk away from your job to one where the surplus is bigger and therefore your wage is higher. But you may get a bad kind of shock, which can occur if your employer gets a negative productivity shock, or there's some kind of exogenous event that bumps you into unemployment. And if that happens, then you lose a lot of bargaining power because you don't have a fallback position that's being employed. And that arrests your rate of improvement in ability by stopping your experience and, of course, stopping your training. Okay, so how does globalization affect these job ladders? Well, it's going to reduce the arrival rate from particular rungs in the ladder, as you probably anticipated. And so by slowing down the arrival rates, then that's going to mean it's going to slow down your advancement up the affected career paths. And it also means that if you do happen to leave those jobs, you're going to get bumped into unemployment, lose your bargaining power, and lose your accumulation of experience. It's also going to affect the incentives to invest in college degrees because college allows you to leapfrog the missing rungs in the job ladder, and you can just jump right in those $90,000 a year jobs without having to work your way up through the ranks. So people who are pondering careers in those jobs look up the ladder and they say, well, I don't want to get trapped in some dead-end occupation. I'm going to college. And basically, that's going to mean that more people are going to college than they used to have. It's shifting the cutoff in terms of cognitive ability downward. And so it's also going to affect income distribution. The people who don't go to college are going to end up being the absolute least qualified. And then we'll have people who who are going to college be more of the next bag. And likewise, globalization is going to affect training incentives because it's going to affect the returns or the amount of rents associated with increases in workers' ability. Now, technological change is going to do something similar in terms of changing the rates at which different types of jobs arrive, changing their demand for those jobs in the labor market. But it's going to change the demand for jobs in different ways. Technological change can, of course, affect non-traded sectors because they get computerized too. So the effects on the career paths are going to be distinct. And if we want to sort those two things out, then we need to ask, well, where's the shock coming from? Is it coming from a change in trade frictions, or is it coming from a change in the production technology? The last time I presented this at the ITI meetings, I tried to skip over the references, and it seemed to irritate at least one person. So I'm going to briefly go through these. There's a ton of relevant literature in the labor literature, all the on-the-job search stuff, putting in red the most related papers. There's also a literature on life cycle earnings. There's a large descriptive literature on job turnover, skill premia, and their relation to tradability of products. And finally, there's a giant literature on skill-biased technological progress. I didn't even try to list all the ones here. I mentioned Acemoglu and Restrepo because the technology they use for production is kind of related to the one we're using. In the trade literature, there are now a large number of models that incorporate random search frictions. Perhaps the most relevant one is by Carl Davidson and co-authors, because that one also has job ladders. The rest of these do not. There may be others out there. I'm not aware of others with job ladders. Carl's is more of an abstract theory piece. Nonetheless, some of the ideas there are similar. There are papers in which tasks get bundled together and traded as intermediates, including work by Sam and Jonathan. There are the way to model product markets is basically going to, it's just taken off the shelf from Calibrated and Barrow. I'll say a little bit more about that later. And there are some papers where trade effects returns to human capital investment, and those are relevant too. Finally, there are papers that quantify barriers to worker mobility, including other stuff by Lorenzo, John McLaren, and numerous other contributors. I guess all three of these guys are here today. There are life cycle earnings trajectory papers, and papers that try to parse out the contributions of globalization from those of technological change. Anyway, that's a very quick, that didn't work. That's a very quick tour of the related papers, and also very incomplete. Let's see. Okay, so before I tell you about the model, let me show you a few stylized facts here. The main data source for this will be the Survey of Income Program participation. And this is a government-generated, nationally representative household survey. It's done in overlapping panels. Each panel lasts about 4 years, and during the period you're in the panel, you get interviewed every month. You're asked, what's your occupation? You're asked, did you change employers? Did you go into unemployed state? And a number of other, your income and other things like that, but those are the key ones for our purposes. We're going to augment that with the Occupational Information Networks, another government database, which tells us the skill requirements for hundreds and hundreds of different occupations. So there are more than 20 types of cognitive skills they document for each occupation, and how much of each of those is used. There are about 20 manual skills documented for each occupation, how much of each of those do they use. So the dimensionality of this database is way too big, and following others in the literature will just collapse those things down to using principal components to one index of the cognitive intensity of a job and the manual labor intensity of a job. So those will be our brain and brawn indices, one per occupation. The rest of these databases are going to play a smaller role. You all know about the world input-output tables. We're going to use those for the trade aspects of the model. And then we use the occupational employment stats to look at how different sectors, the proportions in which they're employing different types of labor. And then finally, the panels to the income dynamics we used just a little bit to look at how people's incomes evolve over their careers. All right, so to start things off, this is a picture describing changes in job-to-job transition rates. So job-to-job transition occurs if you leave one job for another without going through an unemployment spell. And I haven't shown you the levels here. I've shown you how those rates have changed for each occupation. Each occupation is a bubble, and the size of the bubble reflects the share of that occupation in the labor force. Notice that almost, well, not all of them, but most of these bubbles are below zero, indicating that job-to-job transition rates have been dropping in most occupations. Now, on the horizontal axis, we have different measures of the cognitive requirements for jobs. So here's real wages for the different occupations, and you can see that at the higher real wages, there's been less of a decline in job-to-job turnover. In fact, some of these more specialized occupations, they've seen job turnover rates actually going up. But if we look at the low level in terms of real wages, those have dropped dramatically. And that's true regardless of what our measure of skill intensity of the job is. Here's our principal component brain skill measure, same deal. You can see that at the low end of the skill distribution, the turnover rates are dropping, whereas at the high end of the skill distribution, they're not. Same thing for percentage of the occupation that's got college degrees. And then this is bronze skill. So a big bronze scale like that one's probably professional wrestling or something. It's the highest you can get on this scale. You see that that's just the same as what we saw with the brain scale, except that the pattern's inverted. Again, if there's not a lot of brain skill involved, then job turnover rates are falling. Now, the other way you can leave a job is if you transition from employment to unemployment. And here you can see a different pattern in the sense that employment to unemployment transition rates have been going up. And partly that's because this is between 1990 and 2010, and we still have some overhang from the financial crisis in 2010. But generally, job 90 to 2010, these rates have been increasing, and they've been increasing relatively more at the low end of the skill distribution. Again, this is the same for types of quadrants here, types of graphs. So when these low wage guys, the low cognitive skill guys, or people in those occupations lose their jobs, they're really unlikely to be moving into another job, particularly another job which bid them away. They're much more likely to be moving into the unemployed state. And that's been increasingly true over time. And comparing 90 to 10, you can see rates are higher of transitions into unemployment at this end of the curve. Whereas out here, really not much action. The transitions to unemployment are pretty close to unchanged over those 2 decades. Now, suppose that you do leave your occupation and you go directly to another one. Let's just focus on those guys and forget about the people going into unemployment. You can ask, well, are they moving to better jobs or are they moving to worse jobs? And one way to answer that question is to ask, are they moving to a job which has a higher skill requirement than the one that they have now? So let's look at the worst skill intensive occupation, brain skill intensive occupation. I don't know what it is. I'm curious, maybe garbage collection or something. Again, these are changes through time, and you can see that the probability you're transiting to a job which has a higher skill content than the one you're leaving has dropped by 15 percentage points. So that's kind of a major change. If you do transit, then you're not moving on to something better. You're either going to unemployment or you're going to a job which is worse off. And your probability of going to anything better, of course, is zero if you're at the worst possible thing. But out here, you can see that other people are less likely to be moving downward than they were 20 years ago. If you look at the extreme here, the most brain skill intensive occupation, then there's no way they can move up, but they're not much likely to be moving down. And in this range here, people are less likely to be moving down than they were 20 years ago. Okay, and then this is training. This is saying, well, what fraction of these people are getting trained up in different occupations? In 2010 versus 1990, you can see not much change at the low end of the skill distribution, but at the high end of the skill distribution, there's considerable increase. Somebody just started to mow the lawn. I don't know if that's bothering. Is that I can close the window if nobody cares. Okay, but speak up if you have trouble. So in general, in these pictures, you see 2 things. One is that training rates are going up on average, and I mentioned that at the beginning of the talk, but that's mainly coming from the higher skill end of the distribution. I'm going to close the door just a second. Okay, sorry. So here too, it matters where you are in terms of the skill requirements of your job, how your career, your prospects for advancement. And then finally, I'm going to skip some of these, but this is using the PSID to look at how incomes evolve over time. Now let's just focus on the middle one. They're all pretty similar. This is occupational tenure on the horizontal axis. And then on the vertical axis is residual wage. That's after controlling for the standard things, education and gender, and 3 or 4 other things, which I forgot. The top line here is high-skilled, non-tradable jobs. This is tradable sector jobs. These are just based on share weightage averages of where the occupations are employed. And then low-skilled, non-tradable jobs. And you can see that in the top 3 panels are 1990. You can see that these guys used to be catching up over the course of the first 10 years of their career. They used to be getting closer and closer to the low-skilled, non-tradable guys who were still the highest. But if we look at 2000 cohort that's entering in 2000 and then over the next 10 years, you can see that no such catching up is taking place. So the career paths are evolving along with the changes in turnover rates and changes in training rates. All right, so that's the background. Now let's talk about the model. Yes.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
So this is a super interesting set of facts. I was wondering how you squared that with the recent work by Guvenen and co-authors that show in Social Security data in the US that most of the rise in income inequality over the last 30 years is mostly an entry wage change rather than a life cycle change.
I actually don't know that paper. It could be that they're using a more recent data set. Which
it's the
which
paper so I don't remember the name of the. It's one that follows up on the firming up inequality paper.
Okay.
I'm happy to talk about it.
Yeah, no. If you could send me the site, I definitely should look at it. But I'm afraid I don't know. Okay, so we're going to have 3 types of agents in this model. There'll be worker consumers, there'll be goods producers, and then task producers. There are kind of imaginary agents. Let me talk a little bit more about that. So the worker consumers supply labor in a frictional labor market, and then they consume goods. When they're supplying labor, they're supplying to these people we've invented called task producers. And each task producer specializes in a particular type of labor service. So, for example, task 1 may be secretarial services, task 2 may be legal services, task 3 assembly services, task 4 construction services, and so on. I don't mean the fact that there are only 3 here to indicate that that's how many are in the model. It's just that's all we need to make the point. So each task producer is in the market for, when first created, is in the market for a worker. Each one hires 1 worker and then searches for them in this frictional market. And once they've hired a worker, then they can produce labor services of the particular variety that they specialize in. And there are lots of these guys producing task 1, lots producing task 2, and so on. And for each task, therefore, there's a competitive labor market in which those services are provided to the goods sector. So different goods sectors use tasks in different proportions. And so the way we've got it drawn here, sector 1 uses task 1 and task 2, but not task 3. Obviously, that's just an example, but the idea is that that's going to create Stolper-Samuelson type linkages, which come back to the labor market. Now, the rest of this is just Collier-Paro, in the sense that if I crossed out the task producers and made this market competitive, everything else would be the same. So each producer in a sector is going to produce a particular variety of good for that sector. The variety may be tradable, or it might be non-tradable, as we assume down here. And then the varieties get bundled together into a sector composite good, which is either consumed or used as an input by producers. So that's the basic structure. Now, why do we need the task producers? Well, it's important to us to have labor market frictions. And it's also important to us that goods producers use different tasks in different proportions, which means if we had thrown out the task producers, then we'd have goods producers hiring all kinds of different types of labor. And that would make the bargaining game between the goods producers and the workers impossibly complicated. They'd have to anticipate all the different configurations of employment that could evolve in the future when they're constructing the surplus from the match. And so just to get rid of that problem, we threw these guys in here. Very quickly, so this is standard. The only thing that's going to be different from Kali and Paro is that instead of having one type of labor input, a task producer, a goods producer in sector K will use a bundle of different labor services, and that bundle will just be CS agglomeration, oops, pointing down here. A bundle of the intermediates are CS. The labor services for now are a Cobb-Douglas bundle of the different types of services, and these exponents are sector specific, as is the value-added share. So that's the production technology, and when we think about skill-based technological change, then we're thinking about changes in the views and the alphas. Okay, so let's talk about the rest of the model, starting with the worker consumers. They're born with an initial ability level, we could call it A0, and that's drawn from some distribution. Once they've got that, then they look at themselves in the mirror and say, I'm a college person, or I'm not really going to be so great at college, and they decide whether to become a high skill type and spend 4 years in college, or become an unskilled worker and enter the labor force immediately. If they do go to college, it's costly to them, but the cost is inversely proportional to their ability. So kappa is a parameter to be estimated, and A0 is their initial drawn ability. The bigger is A0, the lower is your cost of going to college. Now, once they're out of school, they stochastically improve their ability in discrete jumps as they jump through this discrete space for ability levels. And those happen either because they acquire experience or because of training. And the hazard of a jump at any point in time is given by this equation here. So this says if your education level is E, that can either be an H or an L, and your ability level is A, and you're currently employed at an employer in sector producing J-type services, that employer has a productivity, idiosyncratic productivity Z, then this is the hazard you get if the employer is not training you. You get this extra bonus hazard if the employer is training you. This is the policy function for training, that the employer chooses that as a function of the worker's ability, his own sector of type of labor service he's producing in his current productivity. Okay, so that's how workers are going to improve through time. Let's talk now about these task-producing firms, and let's see a little bit more about how they choose whether they're going to produce or send the worker to training or not. They're each going to specialize in a particular labor service, and those are indexed by J. Each one's going to hire one worker. In the tradition of the search literature, we didn't see a lot of gain from doing a large firm model, but thinking about generalizing in that direction. Once they've got the worker, then they will have matched with that worker in the freshman labor market. Their flow cost of participating in that market is CV. But once they've matched with the worker, then they no longer pay the search cost. They may or may not invest in training that worker, and they're going to experience ongoing productivity shocks given by Z. Okay, so their output then is going to be, this is a quantity of task labor services. That's going to depend upon their productivity. It's going to depend upon their worker's ability level, where zeta can be specific to that task and to the education level of the worker. It also depends upon SJ, which is just a scalar common to all producers of tasks J. Now, it's costly to train up workers, and the flow cost of that is given by C here. That's turned on or off according to this policy function, and as we'll see in a little bit, that policy function is going to be on whenever training increases the flow surplus value of the match. And regardless of what they're doing, as long as they exist, they've got these flow fixed costs of operating their task producing firm. Okay, so that's the task producers. And finally, we need to talk about It's not finally, but we need to talk about random matching. If we add, if we sum up all the vacancy postings from all the task producers in sector J, then we get a total number of vacancies outstanding in sector J. And some of those get matched, some don't. How many get matched is going to depend upon this measure of job seekers. Now, who's seeking vacancies? Well, there are unemployed low-skilled workers, there are unemployed high-skilled workers, and then there are those employed in sector J tilde who are keeping one eye on the job market. So even when you're on a job, there's some probability you'll receive a job offer, which is the standard treatment in job search literature. Now, these have different weights, reflecting the fact that workers' visibility is going to differ depending upon their current situation. In particular, if you're working in sector J tilde, your visibility to sector J may be high or low depending upon how similar your characteristics, the characteristics needed to produce in J tilde are to the characteristics needed to produce in sector J. So if sector J is brain surgery and sector J tilde is garbage collection, then this lambda is going to be really low, and brain surgeon task producer is never going to see it. On the other hand, if this one is something which requires similar skills to sector, if sector J tilde requires similar skills to sector J, then to be relatively visible to the job, to the employer looking to fill a vacancy in sector J. Okay, so how are these lambdas determined? We're using this simple functional form where lambda J tilde depends upon a constant, but also on the distance in job characteristic space between sector J and J tilde. So this is something we took from Sharon Traberman's job market paper. So V is a vector of brain and brawn indices for J, and for J tilde, this is just a unit-free measure of how far apart these two vectors are. So if D is big, then visibility is low. How much lower depends upon this exponent C here, and that'll be an estimated parameter as well, lambda. Finally, how many matches get formed when we have that many vacancies being posted in this measure of job seekers? Well, we're just using a standard matching function, which is C less than denominator. And one nice feature of this is it's bounded between, well, M over V and M over Z are both bounded between 0 and 1, which is to say all the vacancies never get posted and all the job seekers never find a job. But the bigger is C, chi, the more efficient the labor market is and less trouble vacancies and workers have finding each other. Okay, so what about wage setting? Well, that's pretty standard. That's just going to be standard match bargaining over the surplus. And we're going to allow workers to renegotiate their wages after each productivity shock to the firm. The firm's going to have a jump process for its Z shock. So at discrete points in time, these shocks will trigger. And then as soon as that happens, there'll be a wage renegotiation, or it could be that it destroys the surplus in the match, and the worker says, you know, I could do better just going into unemployment and searching for something else. They're also going to get renegotiated after a shock to the worker's ability, which, remember, can happen either because of the experience or because of training. And finally, workers are going to move to poaching firms when match surplus at the poaching firm is larger there. Now, there are variants on this this type of wage negotiation in the literature. This is the simplest one. We could have had it that your employer will match an outside offer and keep you even though the outside offer has a lower surplus than your current job. In fact, we started with that specification, but it just made the code misbehave. Didn't seem to have much, so we've gone to this for now. Okay, so quickly, so how much time do you have, Kim?
You have about 20 minutes.
Okay, so there's no, that's plenty of time. I wasn't sure whether there was discussion in the hour or not.
Yeah.
All right, so if you're an employer, then the value of your one worker firm is going to depend not only on the flow earnings, but the expected capital loss from death shock, expected capital gains from these other types of shocks, and the size and likelihood that, of outside offers, which determine how likely you are to lose your workers and have to enter the market again. If you're a worker, your job is going to depend upon exogenous separation hazards, capital losses and gains from these shocks, and then expected capital gains and losses due to poachers. And then finally, there's a free entry condition for the tax producing firms, which says you never entry continues until the expected value of entry is no longer positive. Okay, this is the last thing before we get to calibration. The college decision is a simple one. Once you've calculated what the value of entering the market as a high-skill worker is and compare that to the value of entering a low-skill worker, evaluate at your particular initial ability level, and all you have to do is ask, well, is that difference in value great enough to more than offset the cost of me going to college? And, this is right-hand side is monotonic positive and A0, left-hand side is monotonic negative. So it's easy to find that solution. And then finally, a training decision is that they're going to train you up as long as that improves the value of the surplus, the match surplus, because the employer is getting a fixed share of that surplus. So that's where this policy function comes from. Okay, so now calibration. We're going to basically do the same level of disaggregation as Kali and Aparo, about 30 industries. But today I want to just talk about a simple calibration with only 5 occupations, essentially because we haven't got the larger number of occupations working well. There's a price for each task. And once you've got a lot of those, you're iterating over a big vector of endogenous prices. But 5 is certainly manageable. Those are, none of my links work. We're taking the one-digit occupational categories from the standard occupational category system. And that's all I'll say about that for now. The numerator is going to be the monthly wage for the average worker. And we're going to assume the economy is in steady state. I won't show you all the steady state conditions here. Some of the parameters we're going to take from the literature. If we want a 4% annual discount rate, then the monthly discount rate is going to be 0033. If we want workers to last an average of 35 years, from 25 to 60 before they retire. Retire is a euphemism in this model. You might better to call them dead because they're not consuming anything once they're gone. But then we need an exogenous retirement rate of 0023. Firm exit rate, we're taking from the exit rates we see in the BLS. Bargaining power parameters, the share of the surplus going to workers as well as the firms, 0.5, just kind of standard default in the labor literature. Matching function parameter, just took from the study. No, we ought to be able to estimate that, but we're not doing that yet. Home production, these figures are shares of the numerator, which remember is the monthly wage for an employed average worker. And they're based on the non-wage income of unemployed workers who are unskilled, and the non-wage monthly income of unemployed workers who are skilled. The cost of a vacancy and the cost of training we're taking from Tybout and Martz. The distribution of initial abilities we're taking from the Armed Forces qualification exam, which is administered to high school seniors. So that's the group we're interested in. When you enter the labor market, you're drawing from a beta distribution, which has a mean of a little bit less than a half. And then finally, productivity shocks, we're going to take an AR1 process and convert that to a jump process with hazard phi and jump interval delta z, just following some tricks that Scheimer has in his papers. More stuff from the literature. The varieties are going to be bundled according to these elasticities from Broder and Weinstein, bilateral tariffs, and dispersion among goods producers within a sector. And this is specific to sectors you're taking from Cohen and Barlow. And then these parameters of the production technologies we're just basing on shares of different types of workers in employment, and then shares of labor in value added and so on. Okay, so that leaves these equations, which we need to calibrate somehow. Remember, this is what the task-producing technology looks like. Sj is the sector-wide constant productivity level. And we're going to say that looking across sectors, that's going to increase with the brain content of the workers, which remember we calculated. These are task-producing sectors. So every task corresponds to an occupation, and we know the brain content from our principal component for that occupation. And we're going to normalize Sj, so it's on the interval from 0 to 1, and then sort occupations from lowest brain content up to highest brain content, spread them across that interval. How we spread is going to depend upon this parameter to be estimated, which we call delta S. And the other parameter here, in terms of gross output production, is the elasticity of output. Of output with respect to worker ability, zeta. That's going to be directly estimated, and that will depend both on what type of task is getting produced and the education level of the employee. Sorry, there are two other parameters here. There's the cost of training, that's coming from the variable amounts, but then we have the fixed cost of maintaining the task producing firm, and that has to be estimated as well. Remember this visibility function, which tells us how likely it is that a job will arrive from sector J if you're in sector J tilde. This is a unit-free measure we get directly from the data, this distance measure, but still we have to get to lambda 1 and the exponent here, C, which is going to tell us how sensitive these things are to distance in job requirement space or job skill, vector of job skill requirements. There's also lambda 0, which is the hazard rate per unemployed worker. And for this calibration, we're not going to distinguish between educated and uneducated workers, although that's something we'll relax in the next round of estimation. Next, we have the hazard of a one-step improvement in employment, in ability. That's got these parameters. That's the hazard that an ability jump occurs in sector J if you're if you're educated or uneducated, and that needs to be estimated. We're going to we shut down variation across sectors for our preliminary parameterization. So we'll just have two of those things. And then there's the bump in hazards that you get if you're getting training, and that's going to depend upon education as well. So we have these two extra parameters. Those are exponents. Those are superscripts, not exponents. And then finally, there's the cost of education that introduces one more parameter here, kappa. All right, so those are the things we need to pin down from the data, and we're going to use this set of moments to do this. We're currently using a much bigger set of moments, but really this is enough to kind of demonstrate how the model works. The first block here are moments that tell us about dispersion in income. This is dispersion among those who have no college education, standard deviation, and then this is dispersion among those who are college educated from the data, and then there's a college premium here. So those things all have to do with these 5 parameters down here, production technology and the training parameters. These things especially drive how rapidly your income is going to grow over time. And you can see that at our converse parameter values, we qualitatively get the fact that the college-educated guys have a lot more dispersion than the others, but we understate the amount of dispersion among the non-college workers. In fact, that's going to be a general pattern here. We get qualitatively everything in this column, but most of these are understated. We do pretty well on the college premium, but less so here. These two are the percentage improvement in your income from when you're 25-year-olds to 45-year-old. This is the data, and this is the, well, these are both data. This is non-college and college. We do pretty well on those, 15% and 38%. So we're picking up the fact that the college-educated guys are getting more rapid growth. The training premiums, again, I guess this is one, well, they're not really comparable. We're getting premiums, but they're not big enough, and the understatement is particularly marked for the training premium. I don't have a good story for why that is, but it's consistent with our general tendency not to get enough heterogeneity here. Now, this next block of moments has to do with labor market flows. So that's telling us about the visibility parameters. These are from these lambda functions, which tell us how likely it is that if you're in sector J, an offer will arrive from sector J tilde, or vice versa. Here we're doing pretty well. We're getting these things in the right ballpark, but we're understating the arrival hazard for workers. Well, these aren't arrival hazards. This is going from being employed to non-employed. We're understating that transition. And then finally, these last two ones have to do with the choice to go to college and then the employer's choice of whether to train you up or not. So obviously the latter has to do with this parameter in the ability jump function, and then college share has to do with the cost of education. So those we're doing fine. These are the parameters themselves. They generally look sensible, although the cost of college education is crazy high. Maybe it'll be there in 5 years, but that's well above what you can, if you remember that renewable errors a month is about $3,600. Anyway, that's our very preliminary parameterization, but it's enough for me to show you that this model is able to qualitatively replicate all those patterns I showed you on the first slide, as well as some that I showed you when we looked at the microdata. And the way I'm going to do that is ask the counterfactual question. Suppose we get a bump in the task prices, we call those RJs, and that bump could have been due to globalization through Stokes-Samuelson effects. It could have been due to computerization. We're not even going to say at this point. We're just going to say, imagine that the lowest task price goes up by 3.5%, and then these middle task prices are dropping, and then the top task price, task 5, goes up by 10%. Where do these numbers come from? Well, those are what we actually observe in terms of the changes in the wages for these average wages for these 5 different categories. So we're just replicating what we see in the data between 1990 and 2005. So we're going to solve the model, get a steady state with the original task prices, and then we're going to solve it again, get a new steady state at these new task prices. I'm not really using the trade part of the model to do this, although we're now at the point where we are incorporating that into our analyses. Let's look at what happens. Well, it's not surprising that
Jim, just
the types of, yeah, sure.
Just a quick question. So it seems like the transitions in this model are going to be somewhat slow with all the scale upgrading. Is looking at these steady states 15 years apart the right thing to do here?
Yeah. So no.
Do you have a sense of like how close
if we looked at the transitions, you're right. It would take a lot longer than 10 years to play out completely.
Yeah.
So we're just asking if we have this order of magnitude of changes in the task prices, what kind of steady state equilibrium would we settle down into? We don't want interpret it too literally as what happened between 1990 and 2005. But yeah, I'd love to be able to do transition dynamics. I don't have a COVID paper, a COVID-19, everybody else does. So I was thinking this could be a COVID paper if we could just get transition dynamics in here. But I think that the computationally that's going to be pretty demanding.
Okay. But Jim, I have a related question. I think the whole point of you building this Calibrated parallel machinery is to generate some cross-sectional like variation in terms of whatever industry you're in. You know, you might be influenced by the trade shocks differently,
Yes.
Which might help you to separate the role of the trade versus you know, something like technological change, right? So it seems
Exactly.
like it seems like but here, you know, you're not in the counterfactual. You're being really.
We're not trying to parse those out here. This is just a really simple.
I think.
Yeah. So that's exactly right. We want to. That's the next exercise we want to do. We thought we might even have some of that ready by today, but didn't get it worked out. But yeah, that was the point of having the trade side in there to begin with. Anyway, let me just talk through the remaining numbers here. If you bump down task prices in these middle occupations and then bump them up on the ends, it's not surprising to see the employment shares adjusting. But what's more interesting is we're seeing the job turnover rates dropping most at the low end of the distribution, even though shares are coming up. And that's exactly the pattern that I showed you earlier on. So just having these changes in the relative task prices is enough to explain the job turnover slowdown, which is a major puzzle in the productivity literature. Notice also that if you look at the transitions into unemployment, these things are really going up here in the middle, and that's consistent with what we saw earlier. Also, the transitions in most of the brunt of the transition to unemployment is borne by these lower categories, and less transition in unemployment is going on in the high-end group. And finally, training shares are going down here in the lower middle categories, but in the top category, we're seeing training shares come up. So again, we're able to explain a feature of the data that isn't obviously linked to task prices. And then finally, if you look at lifetime earnings trajectories, at the bottom end, they're going out. The rate of income growth goes up a little with the slight increase in the price of that task, and then we're getting them flattening out over. I should be pointing this bottom line here. They're flattening out over the middle three categories, and they're getting steeper in the top category. So what's going on here? Well, the job arrival rates are coming down in these middle groups here, and that's just kind of creating a wall, which is causing workers to back up in these lower groups and incomes to stagnate. So to summarize, we're getting a change in relative task prices, whatever their source, are sufficient to explain not only the adjustments that a standard trade model will give you, but also the changing patterns of turnover, unemployment, training, college attendance rates, and relative incomes. I don't have college attendance rates in here, but those are also adjusting in the way you expect. Okay, so I'm about out of time. Let me just summarize. We're moving toward using the full range of occupations and sectors and doing a more serious calibration. It's going slow, but hopefully we'll have those results out soon. We're interested in isolating the effects of globalization once we're at that point, as Daniel mentioned. And we can ask how much of the change in turnover at each skill level, how much of the shift in training and education, how much of the change in wages is due to globalization. And we can also then ask by using the new versus the old factor shares in the data, how much do we want to attribute to skill bias technological change? A different set of experiments we can do is changing commercial policy, or we can introduce education subsidies, training subsidies. We can think about improvements in matching technologies and see how all those things affect the career paths that different types of workers follow. I already mentioned it would be fun to do transition dynamics. I'm not sure whether it's feasible or not. Maybe Nizzy will jump in on that. And then this model can be applied to developing countries and see how different the outcomes look there. So I think I'm out of town, and I'll stop there.
Okay, so we'll open up discussion or broader discussions if anybody wants to. Just unmute yourself and weigh in. You can also raise your hand if you feel like it.
I have a few related questions. I think I think the training part is really novel here, but I've been wondering two questions. One is that you went through the wage bargaining. I'm not sure how that got reflected in the wage bargaining, because it seems like, I invest in my workers, but they could be poached by the other guys, and the human capital he accumulated is actually going to be universal. So how much do
Right.
there's a reasoning for me to kind of squeeze down your wages because you were gaining. And relatedly, I also wonder, back to your policy question, is that going to create any scope for policy there in terms of the firm possibly underinvest? Or
you mean is there a market failure?
Is there a market failure? Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure. That's
yeah. Well, I mean, it's frictional. And there's imperfect competition in the intermediates, I guess. Is that true? No, there's not. But the frictions, you could say, well, that's a market failure. But on the other hand, the social planner may not be able to get rid of them. But coming back to your, so mainly the interest is in the distributional effects rather than aggregate welfare. But coming back to your question about training, it's exactly right that if there were no labor market frictions, you'd never want to train anybody. However, since once you train somebody up, they don't immediately have an opportunity to leave. There is still a payoff to training them. And there's a big labor literature on this, but there's nonetheless sufficient incentive to train them up, even when poachers are out there. And that's all recognized in the continuation values, which are part of the calculations of the surplus from the match.
James, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the decline in the E2U rate. So I was wondering a little bit. So so you find an increase in the E2N rate, I guess, in the model, or
in the model.
In most occupations, but the aggregate has been trending down for many years, and so but that's partly due to a compositional shift that the economy has been shifting to higher skilled workers, and high skilled workers have lower E2U rates. So I was wondering whether you'd get the same type of compositional effect in your model, that as people are choosing different type of education levels, the fact that they switch into higher education occupation groups is driving the aggregate E2U rate down, while still accommodating some increase within these categories.
Well, yeah, so the upper category, it is falling, and the rest is increasing. That's not that different from what we have in the data. Where's that picture? Yeah, so here's EDU. You can see here's zero down here, right? So most of these things are rising as well in the data. And again, this is partly because this is in 2010, which is we still have some overhang from the financial crisis. But that part of the simulation actually matches up to what we see here. These are individual occupations, so it maybe if you ever get it up, you see somewhat different picture.
So I see, yeah. So I guess so within I can see that it increases, but the aggregate has been going down in the data. I mean, quite a lot since the 80s, I guess. So I was wondering whether this you got enough reallocation of workers across education groups in the model to also generate that aggregate decline.
Maybe, but that's something to check. Okay, so we should look at that.
Sorry, Jim, this is Neze here. Just to make sure, I think this is this E2U or E2 non-employment? I guess Alessandro, he's on the crowd, he would know this answer. So it might be This might be E to non-employment transition rather than E to unemployment transition, but we are reporting. But anyway, that doesn't change the fact, I think. But just to clarify, yeah.
Okay. Yes, Alessandra's not out there.
Hello. Yes. No, it's here.
Oh,
This is
there it is.
Alessandro. Yeah. This is employment to non-employment transition, right?
Yeah, that's what
okay.
I thought. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's an important distinction. Sorry about the misleading there.
So, Jim, this is Cecilia Filer. I have a question. It's more to ask you to tell us a little bit more, since you have offshoring in the title, when you were very explicit mentioned that you don't have offshoring in the data yet, or the fact.
Yeah.
How are you planning to identify? Do you have any preliminary results?
Well, yeah. So it's offshoring in the sense that. Sorry.
You don't need to answer if you don't want, but I was curious.
No. The idea is the next experiment is going to be reducing trade frictions, so the increasing fraction of the intermediates within each sector is pulled in from offshore. And that's going to affect some types of workers relative to others, because the sectors differ in terms of their composition of tasks.
But identifying these in the data?
Well, I mean, it's just like a Calibration parallel experiment. Right? So change trade frictions.
I can see it in the model. The question is, do you have anything in the data that suggests that these facts are coming through the increase in offshoring?
Yeah, so that's a good point. I mean, ideally, we would either hold that out as an out of sample check, or we could calibrate to the shares of intermediates coming through imports. We're not calibrating to that now, but that's the sort of thing we could do. Basically, what that would help us do is identify the iceberg costs, changes in iceberg costs.
My original guess was like you guys gonna pin down how the task transform into different variety, and then you're gonna use the differential technology of your model's language, like these task producers impact transmitted from those trade shocks, and then explore, across task variation to identify that. Because there's a tension here, and I understand where you go for this simplified setup, but then you don't have firm as an analysis unit. I would guess, you possibly have occupation as an analysis unit, which would be more like natural here.
We do have
think about impact of offshoring.
We do have occupation as a unit of analysis.
Yeah. But I guess back to what Cecilia was asking, my guess was like, you could potentially, the connection to offshoring is more than just thinking about calendar parallel. It's like you still have to mix the.
Sure, no, that's just the product side of the model, right?
One more step, right?
Exactly. No, we do want to trace it back to what's happening in the labor markets and to the different occupations. That's exactly what we hope to do.
And just to comment on Daniel's on the firm side, I mean, we started this project with a big firm model where, but that we realized very fast that was going to be even slower than where we are. And then we just moved to, one worker, one firm trade-off. I mean, the large firm would be more natural, but it brought lots of problems. So.
Yeah, I totally understand.
Okay, well, I think what we'll do now is we'll kind of leave the stream open and people can continue talking if they need to. For those of you who are sticking around or want to come back, the last session of today's workshop starts at 3:30, so in about 20 minutes. That's Nick Kazaniaskis and Spencer Lyon, who are demand learning, customer capital, and exporter dynamics. So that goes from 3:30 to 4:20 New York time. Okay, otherwise I'm gonna sign off for a few minutes, and I will see you guys then.
This is unrelated.
It's
Go
good
ahead.
to see you online.
Yes. I've been thinking I should be talking to you about our other paper. It's probably not the venue to do that, but I'll be in touch.
Jim, you have to focus on you have to focus on our paper. Come on, Jim. You know? And then Daniel, don't give bad ideas.
I have a detailed question for you guys, and I think it's not very big picture, but like I've been wondering why you guys didn't use any of the kind of wage tenure kind of profile of individual workers to in your calibration, where you look at how does the training technology feed into people's wage.
No, we are using them in the new calibration in the full blown. Now we are running.
In the full blown, you actually using.
Yeah, we are using.
But even what we did here, we have growth in wages.
Yeah, we have something there, but now we are going to do much.
Okay.
We are going to do much more carefully.
Got it.
Jim, I have a question. Nasir also. Hi, how are you?
Hey, how are you?
So I was thinking, I'm curious about what you're thinking about commercial policy. Like, I know this will be after you calibrate the model and everything, but I'm only curious about what you're thinking about.
Just Trumpy sorts of things, or shutting down trade and seeing who's really benefiting. What life would be like under a Trump-style world would be one experiment you could do.
I mean, a very easy experiment would be, lowering the tariffs, but we know that those are small. But then we can also lower the, iceberg cost to get the changes in the trade flows between these two periods, which is, and then interpret that more broadly as globalization and commercial policy. Yeah.
Because you have sectoral variations, so in principle, you can think about how different changes in tariff across sectors.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then there is other trade-related for income transfer programs that are implemented in the U.S. that can be also will be another public policy that we can think about here. Okay, I'm signing off. Jim, I leave you with further questions. Daniel, okay. Lorenzo, George, great to see everybody. Amazing. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Yeah, take care.